What's going on, chess YouTube? So in case you haven't heard, Hans Niemann, my #1 favorite chess player, he just won his round #1 match in the Chess.com Speed Chess Championships. And of course, Hans Niemann beat Maxime Vachiere Lagrave, MVL, the Frenchman, in his first round match. Now MVL, he is a blitz specialist. He just beat everyone, including Magnus Carlsen, in a rapid and blitz tournament. And in this game, Hans Niemann simply outplays MVL in a very complicated anti-martial attack in the Ruy Lopez. It was crazy. And in the end, yes, Hans Niemann, he sacks the queen. So you got to stick around till the end to see it. All right, getting right into it. In the game, MVL, the Frenchman, is white. He plays 1e4, and Hans Niemann is playing as black. He goes 1e5. And very fast, we get a Ruy Lopez on the board. That is MVL's favorite way to counter 1e4. Now, from here, at the highest level, there are two main ways to counter the Ruy Lopez as black. One is the Berlin defense, starting with knight f6, or a6, heading for some sort of martial attack or anti-martial position. Now, of course, the martial attack is a very good opening. It is Magnus Carlsen's preferred way to respond to 1e4 in high-level games, and that is actually what Hans Niemann plays in this game. So, of course, the martial attack, that starts with a6, bishop a4, then knight f6, attacking the pawn, then white castles, black goes bishop e7, white goes rook e1, defending e4, and now finally b5, bishop b3, and short castles. Now, from here, the martial starts with the move c3, and then black goes d5, sacrificing a pawn. Now, MVL actually sometimes plays that as white, but today he had something else in mind. So here, MVL goes a4. This is probably the strongest anti-martial that white has in this position. And from here, black, of course, has a wide variety of options. The most popular options for black being b4, getting rid of the attack on the pawn, rook b8, defending the pawn, or the move that Hans Niemann played in the game, and that is the move bishop b7. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this move bishop b7 was not the most popular choice for a while. However, it has seen a big resurgence in recent years. Black players have found some additional resources to defend. I mean, at one point, Jan Gustafsson recommended this move in his Chessable 1e4e5 course. I know Ding Liren has played it quite a bit as black in recent years. And overall, nowadays, it is pretty much as popular as the main move b4 in this position. So Hans Niemann, bishop b7 on the board. Now, of course, there are plenty of pros and cons to the move bishop b7. The main advantage is that bishop obviously is developed on that long diagonal, where it could be very active if white were to open up the game with ideas like c3 and d4. Now, on the other hand, the drawback of this move is white has the option of slow playing the position, kind of going d3 and then focusing on other developing moves besides c3 and d4 for a while. And that is exactly what happens in this game. MVL going d3, his idea is using a light squared strategy, trying to block out that light squared bishop on b7 out of the game for a while. And from here, MVL's main idea is to go knight d2, then reroute the knight to the f1 square, then probably e3 or g3, gaining access to the f5 and d5 squares. And while he does this whole time, that bishop on b7 is going to look a little bit silly, as it isn't really doing too much yet on this long diagonal. Of course, black is going to have some ideas in this position, so let's see what Hans Niemann comes up with. Here, he goes d6, bolstering his center. And of course, this move prepares the idea of knight to a5. Now, in the Ruy Lopez, whether it's the anti-martial, the Shigorin, or a number of other lines, black is typically going to want to play the move knight to a5, followed by c5, trying to gain some more control over the center of the board. Now from here, MVL, knight d2, just continuing his plan of slow playing the position. So Hans Niemann, knight a5, kicking the bishop. Now that light squared bishop is incredibly important for white in the Ruy Lopez. He has to keep it alive. For that reason, he retreats it, bishop to a2. And technically, this move, bishop a2, does offer a pawn sacrifice. Black has the option of going b takes a4 here. And that is actually quite a decent move. Now, black doesn't play it in the game. The drawback of that move is that black's pawns on the queen side are going to be pretty weak, and white's going to have reasonably good chances of winning back at least one of those pawns. And in the meantime, he can just continue development with ideas like knight f1, knight e3, knight f5, or d5, and so on. But instead of that, here Hans Niemann, c5 on the board, just a very simple idea of trying to clamp down on the d4 square. Now MVL, knight f1. So far, this is all kind of standard Ruy Lopez stuff. And here Hans Niemann Niemann has a very big choice. Again, b takes a4 is actually very popular here, but instead of that, Hans Niemann goes for the move b4, trying to close down the queenside. Now, this is a very double-edged move. If white is to go c3 in the future, Hans may be able to open up the b file for his rook b8 going on the open file. So that is partly the idea behind this b5 to b4 move from Hans. Now, MVL, he has a very big choice here. There are a wide variety of moves he could play, and the best move here is probably c3, preparing d4, but there are other ideas. h3 is pretty good, knight e3 is pretty good here. But instead of all that, MVL, he plays his first mistake of the game, and I don't want to seem like I'm criticizing him, but this really was not the most accurate idea. He goes bishop d2. Now, what the heck is the idea behind bishop d2? If that is what you're wondering here, you're not alone. I am thinking the exact same thing. Now, bishop d2 is actually a pretty common idea in the anti-martial. For example, going back to move 10 here in this position, instead of going knight d2 as MVL did in the game, the idea of going bishop d2 is actually a reasonably common idea. And the idea of bishop d2 here is to control the a5 square, preventing knight a5 from black. And then black is kind of forced to make some waiting moves. White is kind of forced to do some waiting moves as well because the bishop takes up the d2 square, and that prevents knight d2, knight f1, knight e3, and so on. So bishop d2 is a reasonable idea in these positions. However, if we compare that to the position we have in the game here on move 13, obviously bishop d2 is not preventing knight a5. It also doesn't attack knight a5 because b4 is played on the board. So with that in mind, what the heck is the idea behind bishop d2? Well, I don't know. Can someone in the comments section tell me what the heck is going on here? Man, MVL must have some idea that is way beyond my comprehension. All right, now, in the game, Hans Niemann, bishop c8. His idea behind this is he wants to reroute the bishop to the e6 square, or at the very least, simply have it on this diagonal here. That way, if white were to go knight e3 to knight f5, then he would have the option of playing bishop takes f5, knocking off that knight. So overall, the bishop was not doing very much on this diagonal, thanks to white's pawn blockade on the light square, so Hans Niemann simply rerouting it. However, of course, the computer found a better idea. That is the move rook to b8 here. Rook to b8. Okay, the idea behind this move is after white goes bishop d2, his only real idea is to try and force through c3 and d4. And if white does that here, then black can immediately respond with the idea of b3 locking in the bishop, and here the rook is going to be tremendously placed on b8, supporting the pawn on b3. So rook b8, kind of a weird waiting move the computer found. Just wanted to throw it out there for you. Instead, bishop c8, of course, was played by Hans in the game. Now MVL, he goes knight to e3. This is a common idea, again continuing his idea of going knight e3, then knight f5 or d5. However, a better idea here would have been the move c3 and then d4, trying to break in the center right away. So another slightly inaccurate move from MVL. Now Hans, bishop e6, perfectly good move. Of course, rook b8 was also a very good idea. And now in this position, things are already getting really tricky for MVL. There are just booby traps everywhere. Now, first of all, Hans Niemann here does have the simple threat of bishop takes a2. I mean, if white does nothing, that is going to be a threat later in the game, and the rook is going to be very poorly placed on the a2 square. Now, on the other hand, if white were to take on e6, that would actually bolster black's center and take control of the d5 and the f5 squares, and that would leave white's knight on e3 looking kind of silly. So that isn't a good option. Now, in the game, MVL plays a different idea. That is simply c3, preparing d4. However, this turns out to be a huge mistake because here Hans Niemann immediately closes the queenside with the move b3. Now, after that, white is forced to go bishop b1 as that pawn on b3 was defended twice by the bishop and the knight. And now we can see both the bishop on b1 and the rook on a1 are kind of locked out of the game for now. And this is already looking very bad for white. For MVL in this position. So instead of c3, a better idea perhaps would have been the simple waiting moves h3. I mean, white just getting control of the g4 square. Perhaps he's going to go knight c4 next, trying to get rid of some pieces, and maybe white can unwind a little bit. But already white has to play somewhat defensively and try and think about equalizing in this position. So instead of that, c3, and Hans starts to take over in the game. Now Hans, queen c7. This is a very good typical square for the queen in the black side of the Ruy Lopez. And d4 for MVL, and Hans c4. Once again, excellent move, locking down the queen side and trying to show that this rook and bishop on the queen side for white is just stuck out of play. Okay, from here, MVL. Yes, this is a blitz game. Yes, this was played with 5 minutes total plus 1 second per move. So it's understandable why he was making some inaccurate ideas here. But MVL, knight f5, this is not a good idea. It is just begging for the response. Bishop takes f5. So instead of that, knight d5, perhaps the better move in this position. Yes, black can knock off the knight. And here, yes, Hans can take the pawn on d5, but white also has threats on the e5 pawn with the pawn and the knight. And overall, white is sort of unwinding here. White's probably going to be okay. But instead of that, knight f5, and if Hans had simply played bishop takes f5 in the game, then he would have had a huge advantage. He could simply play rook e8 or rook d8, something like that, and he would be sitting pretty. But instead of that, Hans Niemann does not take on f5. Instead, right away, rook to d8. Now, that is the right square for the rook, but he misses a huge opportunity to simply knock that knight off the board. Now here, MVL, the key idea is actually knight takes e7. He doesn't play that. He goes queen e2. Now, queen e2 in itself is not a bad idea. However, he's giving Hans Niemann yet another chance to play bishop takes f5. Now, in the game, Hans misses it, rook e8. But again, bishop takes f5 was the right move here. And now, MVL, he correctly decides to knock off that bishop on e7, preventing any bishop takes f5 ideas. Hans takes back with the queen, and here MVL appears to finally be on equal ground again. So well done, MVL, but unfortunately, he gives away his position literally in one move. He takes on e5, and this looks really dangerous. I mean, isn't white just kind of winning a pawn by taking twice on e5? Well, it turns out he wasn't. We're going to get to that in a second. Instead of that, the best idea for white here was to simply slowly regroup, and perhaps the best way to do that, at least according to the computer, was to start with h3, controlling the g4 square, then following up with ideas like bishop e3, queen d2, and just kind of slowly improving. However, instead, d takes e5 on the board, and this is already super dangerous for white. He had better know what he's doing. Okay, Hans takes back. MVL takes the pawn on e5. It looks like white is just up a pawn. However, there is this intermediate idea, bishop to g4. Of course, now the bishop is attacking the queen and the queen attacking the knight, and black has pressure on the e4 pawn. So this is a tactical minefield for both players. All right, MVL, he's on his A game. He finds the idea. He starts chopping off that bishop on g4. Hans takes back. Then MVL takes with the queen. So far, MVL is okay. Now, of course, Hans picks up that hanging bishop on d2. And again, white is technically up a pawn here, but black does seem to have an edge thanks to his more active pieces, especially his queen and rooks. Now, what does MVL do from here? He starts e5. Excellent idea, opening up that line for the bishop to finally get back into the game. Now, this position here is ultra complicated. Hans Niemann, he has to find the critical move, that is g6. Now, the idea behind this computer move is very, very deep. There are a lot of lines, as we're going to see in the game, where white is going to have the idea of bishop takes h7 check and then bringing the other rook rapidly into the game. And this g6 move, first of all, is prophylaxis. If white were to go, say, queen h5, queen h3, he would threaten queen takes h7 check. And for that reason, g6 was going to be necessary anyway at some point, but g6 here is simply prophylaxis against the bishop takes h7 sacrifice. However, Hans doesn't find that. It was a really complicated idea. I understand why Hans missed it. Instead, queen c5 on the board from Hans. And obviously, the idea here is pressuring the pawn on e5 with the queen and the rook he is threatening to take. again, things are so complicated here. In the game, MVL, he goes for the move queen h4. This looks very logical, especially in blitz. You're threatening queen takes h7. Looks like a very good move. However, that was not the right idea, as it kind of gives Hans Niemann the chance to go g6, which is a move he wants to play anyway in order to prevent bishop takes h7 ideas. Now, instead of queen h4, the right idea here would have been the move queen f4, simply bolstering defense of e5 and hitting the rook on d2. Now, things from here are just crazy. The best move for black is taking on b2 with the rook. And again, the lines here are just ultra complicated. I don't want to go into too much. But instead of all that, here, MVL goes queen h4, and Hans just responds g6. And now MVL's position is critical. There are some tactical minefields. And in the game, MVL makes a big blunder, queen f4. Now, this move may look normal. I mean, why is this a blunder, and why am I adding 2 question marks here? Well, in this position on move 27, Hans Niemann, he sacrifices the queen. Oh, that is disgusting. Okay, real fast, what is the idea here? And believe it or not, no matter what MVL does here, he is completely lost. For example, if MVL takes the queen, then Hans goes rook d1 check, and it is a back rank mate. Either rook takes the rook, game over. Instead of that here, if MVL takes with the queen, it is the same idea. You go rook takes, rook d1, checkmate. Now, really importantly, here's the big idea behind g6. In this position here, if the pawn was on g7, if the pawn was still on g7, then if Hans took with the queen, MVL would take back with the queen, and after rook takes, then he would sack the bishop on h7. The king would take, then he would take with the rook, and the other rook defends the back rank. Oh my goodness, that is the killer idea. That is why g6 is so important, but in the end, g6 was on the board, and that is why in this position here on move 27, MVL resigns on the spot to Hans Niemann. Wow, what a game by Hans, and what a queen sacrifice. Now, before you go ahead and smash that subscribe button and check out my Hans Niemann playlist featuring all of his latest and craziest games. And I'll see you in the next video.